for being here. My name is Lantani de Forez. I'm currently a Barony of Three Mountains, but that's recent, and so I'm mostly Lions March. Yay, Lions March. Many years.
Stole you.
So a little bit of background on me. I was actually a tenured faculty at the University of Idaho. I did research. I do legal research, and then I do research on like social movements and media. So that has been kind of my background and area. And I now work at the Oregon DOJ, so I still do research, but kind of in a different context. So one of the things I'm really passionate about is accessibility, and whether that's physical accessibility or whether that's accessibility in other contexts. And so I think it's really important to make things that can be really intimidating if you don't have a context for it, less intimidating and more accessible, and really focusing on how can we get to these entry points. I will say up front, I obviously have some biases as an academic and as a former academic, and so I will be sharing some of those as we talk, and I'm happy to deconstruct some of it, because we have a little bit of this weird mythos around academics, and like really we're all just nuts, so like it's fine, it's really okay. So today we're going to talk about some of these kind of terminologies around research. This is important, not just if you ever want to enter in an A&S competition here in the SCA, but when you're doing research about something that you're passionate about, a lot of times you will encounter these terms and may not know what they mean. So I like to just kind of use this as a chance to demystify some of that in terms of like the actual research context. And then we'll talk about kind of how to evaluate sources and like how you can tell if it's a good source. And then I have added this extra section on like decolonizing research, where it sounds really academic, but it's really about like just decentering this very like Western mindset, which I think as we have really gotten more into research in the SCA and we have really embraced cultures that are not like Western European, I think it's become increasingly important for us to understand how to bring in outside perspectives and really understand different ways of accounting for research. I'm also going to tie in a little bit of the New Kingdom A&S forms, just because I think that's what our standard is and on tier, and I want to talk about how that's changed some of these definitions and how that's also helped some of these accessibility issues, which I think is really important. All right, feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. If I go too fast, let me know. I used to like cram a lot of information in 50 minutes, so. All right, so thinking about types of sources. You'll hear these terms primary source a lot, sometimes secondary. You very rarely hear this term tertiary. What this is how close you are to the original object that you are studying. So in the SCA, we study a lot of actual physical objects, so that helps understand this a little bit. So if you're trying to recreate the dress, the physical dress that you are recreating is the primary object. If you're trying to copy a portrait, the portrait itself is your primary object, and your primary source, quote unquote. Secondary is when you are looking at a kind of a almost first-hand copy of that. So if like I go to a museum and I take a picture of a portrait, then that is now like my kind of secondary source. I don't actually have the portrait, I can't refer to it, but I have a first-hand photo of the portrait. Tertiary sources, this is more like compilations, indexes, summary things, and so these can still be really useful. So this isn't about the quality of the source, this is just how close you are to the original object of study. Now, sometimes you can't get to the original object of study. So I have some examples in here because I think sometimes in the SCA, since we have so much physical artifacts that we base off of, when people don't have a physical artifact, sometimes they get a little befuddled. I do Sapphic poetry research a lot. There is no extant copies of Sapphic poetry. It does not exist. The most recent copies we have to Sappho's life, which was 600 BC, is about 380, is the closest we get. So almost 1,000 years after her death. And so when we talk about this, there's not even stuff written in the original language. So we don't have anything that hasn't been translated and filtered through multiple generations. So for me, when I have people ask me, like, what is a primary source for Sappho? I'm like, there is none. I can talk about the closest we can get, which is this concept of maybe a, Hellenistic translation of Sappho, who was like this really provincial dialect from 900 years prior. But other than that, like, that's as close as we're gonna get. And so when we think about this, the closer you can get to your primary source, the better. Like, you don't want to just rely off of copies and things that were summarized and put on Wikipedia, but you also have to acknowledge that there has to be some shades here depending on your project. So the further you are from having a primary source to base your research off of, the more that the quality of the research matters. So if you can hold a medieval object in your hands, you can look at it, you can study it, then you can make a lot of understandings about the materials, how it was put together, things like that. The further you are removed from your source, the more you have to rely on other people's research. So therefore, the quality of that research really matters. And so that's where we get to this issue of quality. Also, even if you have access to the primary source, you can go see it, you can study it, you can take photos at a museum, you probably still need to contextualize it with some secondary research. So if you live in Seattle and you go to the Seattle Museum of Art and they have this beautiful portrait and you want to learn how to study it or paint it yourself, you're still having to do research on the pigments, the brush techniques, and how to do all of that. You're not going to intuitively know how to do that just because you can go look at the picture in person. So this is where some of that secondary research is also going to be important, even if you do have access to this primary or first-hand source. I actually love this acronym, even though it's not like that was politically correct. So this is actually a fairly commonly used acronym to teach about quality of research, which is the CRAP test, CRAAP. But I like it because it has some really good examples of things to think about. So currency. So remember, this isn't about the primary source, this is about the secondary and tertiary sources. So how up to date is the information? The more recent, the better. So if there is a scholar that has done research on period pigments from 1980, and then there's a paper that did research on period pigments in 2020, you probably want the 2020 because they have access to more research, they have access to more kind of body of scholarly knowledge, and it's probably more updated. So the more recent you can get, the better. Relevance, that was the information directly related to your topic. Stay focused on your topic. I do a lot with also, it's like wax portraits from like the 15 and 1600s. There's a lot about wax portraiture in other time periods, like Egyptians used them in funerary masks. I can have that as a citation, but that should not be 2 pages of a research paper that I'm doing, right? Like, I can acknowledge other cultures and other time periods did this, but they did it in a completely different context, they did it for different reasons, so it really has nothing to do with my current project. Okay, it's fine. I taught for 15 years. One of the very first semesters I taught, I tripped on a cord, went ass over tea kettle, and flashed the entire room of 18-year-olds. And I still taught for 15 years after that. So really, like, nothing phases you at a certain point. All right. Authority. Who is the author, right? What are their credentials? Was the information published? Where was it published? This can get a little contentious. We'll talk about it with the decolonizing stuff here in a minute. But generally speaking, if someone is affiliated with like an academic place of study, they probably mostly know what they're doing. If someone's just a random person on the internet, maybe kind of check them out, see what they know, what they don't know. And it's not that those of us who don't go through like an academic place of study can't do research. It's just harder to establish those credentials to make sure they really understand and know what they're talking about. So there are people that do amazing work in the SCA, publish it on blogs, and do some really detailed and very, very well done research. But you need to be familiar enough with good research to really be able to evaluate that. So this can take a little bit of practice. Accuracy, where does the information come from? So is it consistent? So I have a chart here in the back we'll look at a little bit, which is like academic versus popular sources. Popular sources are just like everyday things you may like pick up at Barnes and Noble. Academic sources tend to have a little more of a rigorous kind of pathway for publication. And so, you know, something that's in an academic journal is probably better than something that's in like a popular magazine in terms of context. Now, a lot of times popular sources refer to academic sources, so you might see something in like the history magazine of the month and be like, that's really cool. And they'll be like, so-and-so, go look up that scholar, right? Like, that's great. And then purpose. So why was this information published? Is there an agenda behind it? They're weird funding sources. So if you're doing research on, I see this a lot, 'cause I do a lot of feminist research. You're doing research on like gender roles in certain periods and cultures, and then it's sponsored suspiciously by that country, and it spins things in a really weird way. You're like, this is maybe not the most legitimate source. I sometimes see this, Russia does this a lot, and China does this a lot as well, as the governments will fund research to make it look legitimate. And then usually it's like putting a positive spin on some atrocity that's happened at some point in time. So just, keep an eye out for that, just saying. All right, so before we talk a little bit about decolonizing research, I know I've been a little lecturing here. Just kind of questions on this primary, secondary, tertiary, this quality of research stuff. How we doing? Everything's making sense? Good? Thumbs up? Okay. You like thumbs. Excellent. All right. So let's talk about decolonizing, what that means in all of this. So saying decolonizing research, this is kind of a heady terminology here. So what this really means is centering issues and worldviews of non-Western individuals and cultures. So with this isn't just approaching and looking at research from a non-Western viewpoint, but also thinking about ways to look at and sort research and address perspectives of non-Western individuals and cultures. So why this is important, I used to teach a global media class, and my students, are mostly upperclassmen, were really frustrated because they would come up with these really cool topics. They'd I want to look up, journalism in Russia, and they would try to go do research, and they would come up with nothing, and they would be like, I'm failing, I'm doing a horrible job, what's happening? And I had to explain to them, in academia, one of the kind of inherent limitations is Western and particularly American PhDs are considered of a higher quality than PhDs from other countries, particularly South America, East European countries, things like that, and also Asian countries. And so a lot of academics from those places either come to the US and then stay in the US in order to do their academic careers, or they go home to much less prestigious positions. Most research is very Western based because it's based on academic scholarship and academic journals that are based in Western universities. And so this is a really inherent bias that we do not acknowledge very well in academia. We don't talk about it, we don't like to admit it, but the reality is that there's not a lot of what we would consider to be high quality journals and academic publishers that exist outside of the US. There's a lot that we can deconstruct with that, there's a lot of problems with that, but what it leads to is when you go to do a search, even in Google Scholar or one of these other academic places to try to find content, you're probably gonna find less good content on cultures and places that are not Western European in origin. And that's not because you're a bad researcher, that's because there's issues with academic research and some of the biases and priorities with academic research. So for example, for my Sapphic research, I usually have to use less credentialed Eastern European journals because Western European journals don't care about Sappho, they just don't. And so I usually have to use kind of open source Eastern European academic journals to get the kind of research I need for my topic. And then I just have to figure out how to explain that in my sources. I have to essentially not really justify, but rationalize. Say this is why I don't have something from Harvard's, journal on history, because Harvard's journal on history doesn't care about Sappho as a topic. There's also a lot of text-based biases in research. So for a long time, there's been neglect for oral folk traditions, interviews, all of those kind of things. And so one of the things I like to tell people is it's not your job to fix all of this, right? If you're trying to do this kind of research with a non-Western bias, you're not going to magically fix academia. Trust me, I tried for 15 years. But you can acknowledge it, you can challenge it a little bit, you can put a footnote in one of your papers saying, hey, I wish I could have found, I looked in all of these places and I didn't find what I needed. This is a gap in the research. So that way you're at least acknowledging that it's there. You're also kind of challenging the status quo a little bit, which I think is important. I have an example here with feudal Japan. So again, thinking about us as SCA people, we don't always research our own culture. We don't have to. We can appreciate and research other cultures, other topics outside of our own heritage. So thinking about feudal Japan, I know at least early SCA, a lot of people relied on translations of, say, Portuguese or Western explorers that like went to Japan and interacted with them via trade routes. This can be a useful like outsider perspective, but it doesn't really give you any sense of what feudal Japan was actually like. It's always through a colonial mindset. It's always through like a conquering bias mindset. So thinking about this, right, to truly start to represent and research feudal Japan, you're going to need to read direct translations of Japanese accounts. You're also going to want to do a lot of background research to understand Japanese culture. So some of this, like the translations, secondary source, great. But if you don't really understand Japanese culture, if you don't understand Japanese customs, especially during feudal Japan, you're gonna have to do a lot of tertiary research. You're gonna have to ground yourself to understand what those translations actually mean. So I wanted to address a little bit the new changes to the on-tier judging rubrics for ANS. This is mostly for Kingdom ANS, but I think it's something that we tend to have trickle-down effects here in the Kingdom. So there's been a lot of shift on focus for accessibility. And so I wanted to bring in some of the things where this is really relevant for what we've talked about today. So one is less focus on traditional written documentation. So yes, you're gonna have to have documentation at some point, right? Like you have to actually show your work when we talk about entering for Kingdom ANS. And then other ANS competitions that have a requirement for some documentation. But if you're not really comfortable, if it doesn't work for you, you know, in terms of writing a traditional paper, you can do PowerPoints, you can do tables, you can do charts. So there's a lot more flexibility now versus just having like a 15-page documentation attached to your project. We also have a broadened definition for primary sources. So the first part of this went over the kind of academic and the traditional definition of primary source. Because of some of the difficulties we have in the SCA with actually getting our hands physically on extant copies of things, now you can count things like photos of objects and things, translations of you know, different languages or different time periods can also now count as a primary source. So from this, one of the examples, Sappho again, I could maybe argue that like Hellenistic, which are the oldest copies we have, translations of Sappho are pretty much primary sources because they're the closest we're ever going to get. But a lot of medieval scholars also quoted and talked about Sappho, and me trying to use a medieval scholar's translation of Sappho would be a little suspect as like a secondary or tertiary source, because again, they had no context. They were going off of like, I don't know, something that's been translated to 6 or 7 different languages sometimes. And so there's going to be a lot of shift happening with that. And then the third way that there's kind of a focus on accessibility with the new on-tier judging forms is broadened types of accepted sources. So yes, you can still use what are called peer-reviewed articles, so academic journal articles, academic books, but you can also now include as like a very legitimized category oral histories and knowledge, websites, documentaries. I would say still apply the crack test to these, right? So was the documentary funded to present skewed knowledge? Was it actually like decent? Is the interview from someone who has knowledge about what they're speaking on? So it's different if you're reading an interview for someone who's like speaking about their culture versus if you're reading an interview for someone who's speaking about some sort of research that they don't have any background on. So you want to kind of still follow through on some of that and go from there. So I think this is going to be a great change when we talk about issues of just overall access. So the new on-tier judging rubrics, we have this idea of, you know, broadened types of documentation. So a lot less structure is allowed. We have a broadened definition for primary source to kind of account for this disconnect. Not all of us can or often do like go even to Western Europe to see the items that we're trying to like do work on. So being able to rely on museum catalog, museum photographs, and other things as being primary sources really helps some of those disconnects. And And then this idea of being able to rely on different types of sources that can account for more oral and non-written traditions, I think is really important when we talk about, again, trying to deconstruct some of these Western biases. So before we look at places and resources for research, so we went over decolonizing and we went over on-tier and accessibility. Do you have any questions, especially on the decolonizing research and kind of that idea and how we want to think about and work through that?
Do you have any guidance around if you are looking at documentation that's come through an oral tradition, how can we honor and weigh that? Because right now, most of our rubrics and guidance are really around, of course, written documentation traditions.
Yeah. So you're talking about using oral tradition as a source of documentation or as documentation?
Both, and things that came from cultures that was how the knowledge was passed.
Yeah.
So how do we take examples? So if we have people, we now have people recreating clothing and food from indigenous cultures.
Yeah.
So if those are brought to kingdom, we need to start thinking about how we're going to equitably judge that against something from a Western tradition.
Absolutely. I think I personally, if I was like an author wanting to do this, like as part of my entry, I would probably have a primer or a couple of paragraphs, maybe as a footnote or in the body of my paper explaining the importance of oral tradition to that culture, and then maybe giving an example or two when we talk about like the accuracy and longevity of that oral cultural tradition. And so just saying like some of these stories actually recount the Ice Age from 10,000 years ago, we should maybe pay attention to them, right? Like that's important. And so for me, I would probably just try to contextualize that, thinking about like how do I counter Western perceptions of oral tradition, particularly on issues of accuracy. And so I would be like, this is how we know that there is accuracy in oral tradition. And therefore, in that context, here is this oral aspect of my research. In terms of the actual documentation itself or presenting documentation, I would love to see people doing like recorded oral explanations, where instead of having to write or just copy the oral tradition down as part of their A&S like display, be like, okay, in the spirit of the oral tradition that I'm recreating, I'm going to do this part of my documentation as a video presentation or oral presentation, or even just have audio. The technology is accessible enough at this point that I don't think that is going to be too high of a barrier for a lot of people. It doesn't have to be, Hollywood production. It can be your cell phone. But I think being able to give people the experience of oral and audio versus like the whole body with a text and paper. But I do think it's probably going to be important to have like a context around that and help people that are doing those entries be like, okay, at this point I'm going to give you the oral tradition part of my paper or my presentation, and then kind of step in and out of it, because I think it is going to be a bit of a transition when we talk about how we incorporate these sources and the style of documentation. That would be my recommendation personally. Not that I'm in charge, let's be clear. Not in charge of anything, it's great. So that would, I think, be an important thing, is just to give that context versus just cold doing it with no like explanation. I do think a lot of us are going to want to see that explanation, that context, but also to understand the importance, to honor the importance of those sources, as opposed to it just being seen as like a gimmick or something that is not authentic. Yeah. Any other questions on decolonizing stuff in particular? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about places and resources for research. I used to tell my students all the time, right? Like Wikipedia and even SCA blogs, they are a great starting place, right? Like go get the lay of the land, learn some of the terminology that you are wanting to use, particularly if you're doing a new area. Trying to figure out what terminology is actually going to get you the search results you want is difficult. It's like one of the hardest starting places. I will say Google Scholar has some academic works. They don't have everything. They also tend a lot towards science biases, so that's great if you're doing like a chemistry study on something, but particularly a lot of the humanities and like literary and historical stuff is not in Google Scholar. It just doesn't exist there. So just kind of be aware that that is a lack in that resource. If you went to college, or if you have friends or family who'd be willing to let you use their name, quite a few colleges actually have alumni programs where for a small fee you can have access to their libraries. These are usually have a lot more academic sources than public libraries will. So I went to Penn State, so I went to 3 universities and only one of mine has an alumni program where I can get online access to the academic journals. The other ones I have to be physically in location. I could physically go to the library, but they're in Florida and Texas, so that's not going to happen. And so Penn State, I think it was like $50 a year, and then I have access to all of their online journals, which is a lovely kind of step in the right direction for me to be able to continue my research. If you don't have access for college alumni access, a lot of public libraries do have an interlibrary loan program, in particular for things like audiobooks, microfilm, copies of articles. That can be really easy to accomplish. And I know that's probably been talked about today, but for those of you who don't know, academics don't make money off of any of our publications. We don't. We don't get paid, we do it all for free. And so, and also no one ever cares what we do. So if we get an email from a random person saying, hey, can I have a copy of your article? That will make their week, that will make their month. They will throw a party in your name. It's really exciting. And so I know a lot of us feel awkward just cold emailing some random academic and being like, I found your article about shoes. Can I have a copy of it? Because it's behind a paywall. But again, we don't get paid for any of that. Like that's just part of our jobs. And so it's really exciting to us to be able to share research with other people. I will put an asterisk in that academics are very busy and sometimes we're not the most social people on the planet. And so if they don't respond to you for a week or two, it's not because they're upset or mad at you. They're probably just having a nervous breakdown and or grading papers. So like, don't take it personally.
Why
Just,
right?
like how many times have I was like, I curled up under my office desk grading papers? It was a lot. And so just thinking about that, I like to give people a heads up on that, because again, we can get a little feral sometimes.
Think about what time of the academic year you're emailing them.
It depends on the year, yes. Pretty much Halloween to Thanksgiving is bad. You can still email them, they're just probably not gonna be super responsive because everyone's, like all the students are having a nervous breakdown and then the stress kind of carries over. Shocking how common that is. So the last bit here is I have a chart. This is not my chart. This has been created in conjunction with University of Victoria's research page, but it was one of the better charts I have seen. I've looked at hundreds of these over the years for my students. And this is just scholarly versus popular resources. This is something people can really struggle with when they're figuring out what to look at, how to think about it. So it shows you like on one side, like what the scholarly version of the content is versus the popular. So popular magazines, newspapers, what's the scholarly version? Scholarly academic journals, right? When we talk about like the audience, the author, article structure, and so it just gives you some tips on how to assess if something is actually an academic versus a popular source. Again, the popular sources can be really useful, but kind of treat them like tertiary sources, Wikipedia sources, where they're not going to be comprehensive and exhaustive, but they can be a nice kind of entry point, or, you know, just give you a taste of, is this topic interesting? So my wax portraiture stuff, I went to England last year and was seeing these really cool wax portraits in the Walls collection. And I was Googling about them, and I couldn't figure out what to Google, so I'm like Googling like wax people, 3D, because they're essentially cameos that are incredibly lifelike, made out of wax. Super weird. And the entry point for me was actually a blog post from a former curator at the V&A Museum, and she was talking about the feminist history of these cameos. And like it had not really clicked for me because that wasn't covered in any of the like museum curatorial stuff that I saw in person. But she, as a former curator for the wax portraits at the V&A, was talking about how women were banned as sculpting, like formal sculpting programs till the 1700s, 1800s. And so wax sculpture was one of the few places where women could sculpt as artists in a socially acceptable way. They also tend to not be displayed in museums because most male curators see them as like women's work and not as particularly interesting. And so I went, oh, that's why I've never seen these before in any other museums until I saw these like 10 in England. And so it was really fascinating, and that blog post made the connection for me to do really in-depth academic research, and it gave me a really good kind of emotional connecting point, even though we would generally say like, oh, it's a blog post, what does that give you? But that gave me that area of study. So, not to completely discount that kind of stuff. All right, any other questions, comments, things that you think could be useful for everyone else to hear from your own experiences?
So the other piece that I would say is just because something is in a museum, I think that we have all in our careers run into situations where we see inaccuracies.
It's not labeled correctly.
Constanza and I had the opportunity to travel to Europe this year, and in a museum, was it in Ireland or was it in Scotland?
Yeah.
In Scotland, we found portraiture of Eleanor de Toledo, and it was labeled as a
Spanish.
Irish an Irish noble
In
woman.
a Spanish dress.
And we both went, what?
Spanish woman you could come up
And
with.
it was like
It's a famous
the
dress.
photo.
Yeah,
Like,
the one.
Eleanor de-
Yeah.
We're all like, excuse me. Pick any other picture at all.
So, you
Right, like I'm
know,
having a panic attack over this, it's not.
right, so, you know, museums are definitely wonderful resources, but even there, it was this very interesting, British Isles versus, you know, potentially Muslim influenced culture of Spain, and it was a little eye-opening, I have to say.
I definitely almost got kicked out of the British Museum because I was really upset at some of the older like informational plaques that they hadn't updated.
Oh, yeah.
Because they would say things like, "We rescued these Greek statues from like, you know,
Yeah.
We had to kill several hundred people to do it too.
right,
Right.
war lands, or like,
Rescued.
thankfully this, you know, this warlord gave us these pieces when he ravaged the countryside, and I was like, I can't.
Yeah.
So I was getting really like a little spicy about it. And all the curators were like doing this. Kevin's grabbing me by the back of the display. He's like, you're gonna get me down in British Museum. And I kept going, rescue? Rescue?
Yeah.
As a fun fact, Greece built an entirely new Parthenon museum like a decade ago, specifically so that the British Museum could not say, well, we're taking better care of them, you know.
Yeah.
It is beautifully staged.
I just want to echo the efficacy of reaching out to academics, and not just academics, but also museums. I've wanted a picture of something, but the only thing they have is a picture of the front side of the object, right? And sometimes to understand the construction of something, you need to see what the back looks like. And I have emailed places like the British Museum, the Bibliothèque of Paris, and said, hey, do you have any more images of this? And sometimes it takes a couple weeks to get a response, but like the response I got was, well, as it happens, we're about to take that object off display for conservancy, so we'll take more pictures. They sent me the pictures after they took them, but then they put the pictures on their website also. So if you ask them for more information, you might not just be benefiting yourself, but other researchers. And my favorite story of writing to an academic is, I kept seeing reference to this conference paper. And I couldn't find the paper anywhere. It wasn't behind paywalls.
Yeah.
It was just reference to other people's papers, which is not that uncommon because sometimes conference papers aren't actual papers. So I wrote the guy over like what should have been his semester break for winter, not expecting a response. I got a response within 2 days, which basically said what I already knew. Hey, this is a conference paper, but what I can do is I can send you the pre-published version of the book that all of that research is going into. And he sent me a PDF copy of his book before it went to print, so that I could continue to do it use it for research. And I correspond with him to this day. This is like 5 years ago now.
That's super.
So like, you can form relationships with academics because, and this is what he said to me, there is nothing I love better than getting an email from somebody who is not one of my students wanting to know about my research.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I was an academic for 15 years, I published extensively. My mother still had to carry a laminated summary of what my job title meant. Because people would be like, what is media law? And she would have to get out and read it to them. Like, no one has read my research, no one knows what I do. And so like, anyone cares, I was like, oh, thank you for caring about what I do. That's probably why the SCA is fun, right? Is we all get to share our geek and we actually listen to each other, but academics don't usually get to that. So like, it's lovely when that happens. I'll also say the smaller the museums, they may not have as much curatorial resources, but especially if you visit in person and you're really nice, a lot of times they'll let you take pictures and see things behind the scenes, just saying. I definitely talked my way into a lot of places in Venice that had no and I'm like, here's 10 euros. I'm just doing research. I won't use the flash. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. So I was like in a Byzantine obsession at that point. So I was walking around taking pictures of Byzantine footwear for like 2 hours. So anyway, fun things. So yeah, so again, be creative. Think about how you can tie all this together. Talk to other people, right? Like we all like to help each other. So make sure you're not trying to, if you're getting stuck, don't just like, be like, I have to know how to do this. None of us know how to do this. We're all learning as we go. And honestly, the research is going so fast, like it changes all the time.
Do you have any suggestions for how to research something when there are basically no English language resources? I've got all 3 books in English, and I would like to not wait 5 years to become fluent in another language to be able to learn more.
No, they're Portuguese.
No, I've got 3 English language books, and I've
That's
got
great.
2 Portuguese language books.
Got it.
So is the book content in particular what you want?
Yeah, because it's like one of those really niche things that there's no information, and it's done by a group of people who are usually illiterate, so.
Yeah. Realistically, I would probably go on Fiverr, which is like it's a place where you can essentially, I'm sorry, I'm really easy at the end of the day. Yeah, you can do contract tasks and stuff. There's gonna be translators on there, particularly like native Portuguese speakers, and see if they will read and it'll be for a fee, but it probably won't be that much of a fee, and they will have to pitch you the amount. But even if you want to do it like a chapter at a time, just so you can start like digging into stuff, that might be a good entry point.
It's like FIVER?
Yeah, FIVER, and it's an app / website. And so a lot of people do editing services and translation services on it, and there tends to be a lot of international people who sign up for it who underbid because, right, like pay discrepancies, but you're more likely to run into people who actually speak like native Portuguese there who want to do translations.
Exactly what they need.
Yeah.
Can I make a recommendation to you? If you are really anxious to get started on something like that, Google Translate has a section where you can actually translate whole pages of books.
I've tried it. Unfortunately, the best source I have is from a guy whose last name is Baptista, and it's from the 1800s. And
So
that's
it's tricky.
a
Yeah.
bad translation.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you can,
I
in
look at it
particular, like on the Fiverr, you can post and say, hey, I need someone who can do more of like an 1800s
Yeah.
older dialect, and they'll probably, and they should be able to tell you, like, hey, I can probably do it 70% of the way, or 80% of the way, but it's probably gonna be more accurate, and it's probably not gonna be that expensive, especially if you say, like, I wanna do it by the chapter, or by the hour, and go from there. And a lot of them, again, you'll have, like, there'll be a whole translation section, and you can just browse through people's, portfolios and stuff like that too. Yeah, which is awesome.
Well, and I was gonna say too, on that note, there was actually a foodie in the West who took up a collection, found this fascinating manuscript, that was a culinary manuscript from, I think, Transylvania, that had not been translated, and took up a collection, and within like 4 hours, they did an estimate, got funded, and had this entire manuscript translated.
Probably
As a
not an option for me. No one's interested in the things I'm interested in.
Well, what I'm saying is you might be surprised.
Portuguese tapetes. They're a rug that instead of being a knotted rug or a woven rug, they are an embroidered rug. They were made in exactly one place, Arelas, Portugal, which is a tiny village in the middle of the mountains.
This is very specific.
Yes, it's extremely specific.
Don't assume.
I got to visit the only museum in the world that's been open for 4 years.
But I can see that being still, I mean, there are people who would be possibly, I'm fascinated.
Yeah.
I hope fun that.
Like,
I can
like
$10
there-
for that.
So, I mean, just in terms of like, people who are in embroidery, and there's this thing. But then the other flip side of that is, if you do it all your own, that is just your thing and you
Yeah.
essentially own that translation.
Mhm.
If you crowdfund it, it belongs to the crowd.
Yeah, but I don't want to bombard stuff.
That's awesome. Thank you all so much for engaging and caring about research. I think it's like one of those topics we either really love or it's like that. Nah, I don't wanna. So thank you all for engaging with it and talking today about it. I do have more handouts, so if you wanna grab an extra one for any reason, let me know. And thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.